In 1970, a gallon of milk cost about 60 cents. A dozen eggs cost around 60 cents too. A new car, a full actual car, cost around $3,500. Today, that same car costs more than 10 times that. The milk costs 6 times as much. And your paycheck? For most people, it hasn't grown anywhere close to 10 times, or even 6 times. So here's the question that should actually bother you. Where did all that value go? Because the milk didn't get better. The eggs didn't get better. In most cases, you're getting the same product, or an arguably worse one, for dramatically more money. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why your money buys less every year, and why it's almost never about greedy corporations, bad luck, or one specific villain, no matter how satisfying that explanation feels. There's one number buried in economic reports that almost nobody pays attention to, and once you understand it, you'll never look at a price tag the same way again. We'll get to it. Stick around. Let's start with the belief that's probably sitting in your head right now, that inflation happens because things cost more to make. More expensive materials, higher wages, supply chain problems, so companies pass the cost on to you. And that's true sometimes. Economists actually have a name for that specific kind of inflation. It's called cost-push inflation, and it's real. There's also demand-pull inflation, where too many buyers are chasing too few goods, bidding prices upward simply because everyone wants the same limited supply of something at once. Both of these are genuine forces, and you'll hear commentators blame one or the other depending on the headline of the week. But here's what those explanations conveniently leave out. Neither one explains why prices go up almost every single year, forever, across nearly every product category, in nearly every country with a functioning economy. Something else is happening underneath both of these surface explanations, and it has almost nothing to do with the price of eggs and almost everything to do with the price of money itself. Here's the real mechanism, and it's simpler than you'd expect. Money is a good, just like eggs or oil or lumber. And like any good, its value is determined by supply and demand. When there's more of something relative to demand for it, each individual unit of that thing becomes less valuable. Print more dollars without a matching increase in the goods and services those dollars can buy, and each individual dollar buys a smaller slice of the economy than it used to. This is called monetary inflation, and it's the quiet engine running underneath almost every other explanation you've ever heard for rising prices. Every other type of inflation, cost push, demand pull, supply shocks, those are surface-level events layered on top of this deeper, constant current.
So who controls the supply of money? In most modern economies, that's the job of a central bank. In the United States, that's the Federal Reserve. And central banks aren't villains here, even though it's tempting to cast them that way. They expand the money supply for real reasons, to prevent economic collapses, to encourage borrowing and spending during downturns, to keep an economy from grinding to a halt during a recession or a crisis.
When the money supply stays roughly in step with the actual growth of goods and services in the economy, prices stay relatively stable. But every time more money enters the system faster than the economy actually grows, the value of each existing dollar quietly gets diluted. It's not theft exactly. It's more like slicing the same pizza into more pieces. The pizza, the actual goods and services in the economy, didn't get bigger. You just have thinner slices now, and everyone holding dollars gets a thinner slice too, whether they printed a single bill or not. Now, how do we actually measure this dilution in everyday life? This is where that hidden number comes in, the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Government statisticians build a representative basket of goods and services, groceries, rent, gasoline, healthcare, clothing. meant to reflect what a typical household actually buys. Every month, they track how much that exact basket costs compared to the month before and compared to a year before. When the media says inflation is running at 3%, what they usually mean is that this basket of goods costs 3% more than it did 12 months earlier. It sounds like a small, tame number. But small numbers compound. 3% inflation, repeated year after year, doesn't just add up, it multiplies. The same way compound interest multiplies a savings account, except here it's working in reverse.
There's another wrinkle to this that makes inflation even harder to spot in real time. Companies don't always raise the price tag directly. Sometimes they shrink the product instead and leave the price exactly where it was. A bag of chips with noticeably more air in it, a roll of paper towels with fewer sheets, a candy bar that's quietly 10% smaller than it was 2 years ago. Economists call this shrinkflation, and it exists because companies know that customers notice a price increase immediately, but rarely notice a subtle size decrease. Functionally, it's the exact same phenomenon as regular inflation. You're paying the same amount of money for less actual value. It's just been disguised so it doesn't show up as clearly on the sticker.
Now let's escalate. Because mild, steady inflation is one thing. Most developed economies target somewhere around 2% a year, which sounds harmless, almost invisible. But history has shown what happens when this process gets out of control. Take Germany in the early 1920s. After the devastation of World War I, the German government owed massive reparations it couldn't pay through normal means. So it did what governments under extreme pressure sometimes do. It printed money, aggressively, to cover the gap. At the start of 1922, a loaf of bread cost around a few marks. By late 1923, that same loaf of bread cost literally billions of marks. People were reportedly paid twice a day because prices would double before their next paycheck arrived. There were stories of people using wheelbarrows just to carry enough currency to buy groceries, not because they were rich, but because the currency itself had become almost worthless, one bill at a time.
That's not the only time this has happened either. Decades later, Zimbabwe went through something strikingly similar. Through the 2000s, the government printed money at an extraordinary pace to cover its own spending gaps, and inflation eventually became so extreme that the country issued a $100 trillion banknote, a single piece of paper with 12 zeros printed on it. And by the time it was in circulation, it could barely buy a loaf of bread, sometimes not even that. People's entire life savings, held in the local currency, were rendered essentially worthless within a matter of months. More recently, Venezuela experienced its own version of this same collapse, with inflation so severe that people reportedly weighed stacks of currency instead of counting it, because counting took longer than the money was losing value. These are extreme cases, hyperinflation, and they're rare. But the mechanism is identical to what happens in your everyday economy, just turned up to a catastrophic degree. None of these governments set out to destroy their own currency on purpose. Each one was cornered by circumstances, and each one made the same trade-off every central bank makes when it expands the money supply, just at a scale and speed that broke the entire system. The lesson isn't, this could happen to you tomorrow. The lesson is that inflation isn't a mysterious force of nature. It's a direct, measurable consequence of the relationship between the amount of money in circulation and the size of the real economy backing it.
Now, here's where the data gets uncomfortable. And this is the part that actually affects your life directly. Since the early 1970s, wages for most workers in developed economies have grown, but they've grown much more slowly than the cost of living, and especially more slowly than the cost of specific big-ticket items: housing, healthcare, education. Overall consumer prices, measured by that same CPI basket, have risen dramatically over the past several decades. But wages,
adjusted for that inflation, what economists call real wages, have barely budged for a huge portion of the workforce during that same stretch. That gap between what your paycheck grows by and what your cost of living grows by is the exact reason so many people feel like they're working harder for less, even when their nominal salary looks higher on paper than it did 5 or 10 years ago. Nominal numbers went up. Real purchasing power did not keep pace. And this gap isn't evenly distributed either. The specific categories that have outpaced general inflation the most, housing chief among them, are exactly the categories that determine whether people feel financially secure or financially squeezed.
So what actually protects you from this, if the system itself is designed to gradually erode the value of cash sitting still? Here's the open loop payoff, the number nobody talks about. It's not really about the dollar amount in your bank account. It's about whether your money is parked in something that also grows or something that just sits there losing value at the same steady rate every year. Cash sitting in a low-interest savings account is quietly losing purchasing power constantly, even while the number on the screen stays the same or ticks up slightly. Assets that are historically correlated with the pace of inflation, real estate, equities, ownership stakes in productive businesses, tend to at least keep pace with and often outpace the rate at which currency loses value. This is why the rich get richer isn't just a slogan. People with assets benefit when asset prices rise alongside inflation. People holding only cash lose ground every single year, quietly, invisibly, 1 percentage point at a time.
And notice something important about this distinction. It has almost nothing to do with how much money you currently have. It has everything to do with what form that money takes. A small amount of money in an asset that grows with the economy behaves completely differently over 20 years than the same amount of money sitting in cash. This is a structural, mathematical reality, not a lucky break reserved for people who already have wealth. It's a formula available to anyone who understands it early enough to act on it, whether that's a retirement account, a modest stock portfolio, or even a small stake in property. The exact vehicle matters less than the underlying principle of not letting money sit motionless against a current that's always moving.
Let's bring this back to your actual life, because this video was never really just about eggs and bread. Every raise you get that barely covers your rising rent, every year your grocery bill creeps up while your salary stays flat, every time saving cash in a regular checking account feels like playing it safe, all of that is this exact mechanism, playing out in real time in your own bank statements. The 2% target inflation rate that sounds so harmless compounds over time, the same way interest does, just working against you instead of for you. Money sitting still for 30 years under a modest, normal inflation rate can lose more than half its real purchasing power over that stretch, even though the number printed on the account never goes down. Run the math on your own numbers sometime. Take whatever you're currently saving in cash and imagine that same amount losing a small percentage of its real value every single year, compounding for as long as you plan to hold it there. The number on the statement stays comforting. The purchasing power quietly does not.
So here's the resolution. And it's uncomfortable precisely because it's so simple. The goal was never to accumulate the biggest possible number in a cash account. The goal is to hold assets that move at the same pace as the economy itself, so that inflation isn't quietly draining your effort every single year while you're not looking. This doesn't require being wealthy first. It requires understanding, early, that cash is a melting ice cube, and assets are closer to a garden that grows roughly in step with everything around it. It also doesn't require picking the single best investment in the world or timing markets perfectly. it mostly requires not leaving large sums parked in something that guarantees a slow, steady loss of value for years or decades, simply because moving it felt unnecessary or intimidating.
Think about it in terms of two imaginary people, starting from the exact same place. Person 1 keeps every dollar of extra savings in a standard checking account for 30 years, watching the number slowly climb from deposits alone. Person 2 takes that same money and places it into a diversified basket of productive assets. Again, nothing exotic, nothing that requires a finance degree to understand, and simply leaves it alone to move with the broader economy for those same 30 years. On paper, at the start, they look identical. 3 decades later, person 1 has more dollars than they started with and feels like they did something responsible. Person 2, historically, ends up with dramatically more real purchasing power, not because they worked harder or earned more, but because their money was never standing still against a current that never stops moving. The starting amount was identical. The form it took over 3 decades was the entire difference.
Go back to that car from 1970 for a second, the one that cost $3,500. If that money had simply sat in cash for the last 5 decades, it would still technically exist, and it would still buy almost nothing close to a car today. But if that same amount had been placed into an asset that historically tracks with the broader economy, it would very likely be worth many multiples of its original value. Not because of some secret trick, but because it was moving with the tide instead of standing still against it. That's the entire difference between watching your money slowly erode and watching it hold its ground. It's the same $3,500, the same starting point, but 2 completely different outcomes depending on one decision made decades earlier. Did it move, or did it sit still?
If there's one thing to take from this video, it's this. Stop measuring your financial progress purely by the number in your bank account and start asking what form your money is actually sitting in. Because the same $20 bill that bought a full cart of groceries decades ago buys a fraction of that today, and it will keep losing value at roughly the same steady pace for the rest of your life, whether you notice it or not. The economy isn't standing still, so your money can't afford to either.
If this changed how you think about your paycheck or your savings account, subscribe, because next week we're breaking down exactly how central banks decide when to raise or lower interest rates, and why that single decision ripples through your mortgage, your credit card, and your job security more than almost anything else in the economy. It's a lot closer to your daily life than you'd think.